Bien, bonjour à toutes et tous. Merci pour votre présence en ce mardi après-midi qui est aussi l'après-midi du dernier épisode de ces séminaires. Nous arrivons donc au bout de la réflexion complémentaire à celle que je mène par ailleurs dans le cadre de mon cours. Et jusqu'à présent, donc, nous avons parlé de normes, nous avons aussi parlé d'autorité, mais aujourd'hui, et c'est l'intérêt, je pense, de cet après-midi, nous allons nous concentrer davantage sur la question de l'autorité en parlant des agents qui sont les porteurs de cette autorité et les modalités de fondation et d'affirmation de cette autorité religieuse. C'est pourquoi j'ai donc le grand plaisir d'accueillir d'emblée Beate Dignas, collègue de l'Université d'Oxford, donc professeur d'histoire ancienne à l'Université d'Oxford. Alors Beate a mené son parcours universitaire en Allemagne, à Münster, si je ne m'abuse, avant d'obtenir son doctorat en histoire de l'Antiquité à Oxford. Et ce doctorat a donné lieu à la publication d'un magnifique livre qui a été publié en 2002 à Oxford University Press, intitulé Economy of the Sacred in Hellenistic and Roman Asia Minor, qui reste un des piliers pour toute réflexion sur les questions de l'économie liée au sanctuaire à cette période et dans cette région, avec aussi, on en parlait il y a deux minutes, des pages magnifiques sur la prêtrise en Grèce ancienne, qui nous font espérer qu'à un moment ou à un autre, Beate nous donnera une belle monographie sur la question de la prêtrise. Alors évidemment, elle a publié de nombreux articles sur l'histoire grecque, sur la religion grecque, surtout à la fin de l'époque classique et l'époque hellénistique. Et plus récemment, elle a publié différents ouvrages collectifs. En 2020, mauvaise période pour les livres, j'en sais quelque chose. A Cultural History of Memory in Antiquity. Je pense qu'une partie de ce dont elle va nous parler aujourd'hui relève de cette question de la mémoire. Un autre collectif en 2018 intitulé Wandering Myths. Et puis deux réflexions très utiles, encore une fois, pour tous ceux qui travaillent sur le personnel du culte dans le monde grec. Un ouvrage en 2013 qui s'appelle Priests and Seers in the Religious Cultures of the Roman World, et en 2008 Practitioners of the Divine, et ce sont des coéditions avec différents collègues. Donc voilà, cet éventail de publications, je pense, est très significatif des intérêts de Beate et explique pourquoi je lui ai demandé de nous rejoindre pour réfléchir ensemble sur la question de l'autorité religieuse. Beate, je te donne la parole.
Thank you very much, Vinciane. Thank you very much for these kind words, but also for inviting me to give this paper today. And I apologize that I'm speaking in English. I hope that's all right. There is a handout which is basically bibliographical references, as not in alphabetical order, but as they appear as I refer to them in the course of the paper. Studying Greek priests can be frustrating, especially when one wants to make statements that capture essence and have general application. The particular appears to dominate the universal, and often political context appears to explain away a religious realm. Different genre and types of sources don't seem to add up. My encouragement to persevere has in fact been Vinciane. In her introduction to the Teskra volume dedicated to the personnel of cults, she assures us neither the lack of a sacerdotal class based on vocation nor the political face of Greek priesthood necessarily turn the Greek priest into a magistrate like any other. And if we keep examining and re-evaluating all types of material, with the incentive to explain the lack of congruence where it emerges, we will move towards an understanding of Greek priesthood. In this paper, I want to ask the question, did Greek priests hold a crucial role in the processes that created and controlled collective memories within and beyond their communities? Undoubtedly, religion was the central medium of public communication about identity in the ancient world. The strong emphasis on civic identity in religious contexts drew religious and social identities together. Everyday practices of social groups within Greek communities were bound together by shared religious practices that created meaningful memories through collective experiences, or were themselves part of fundamental cultural memory. Remembrance, commemoration, and memory lay at the heart of rituals. Memory media were the foundations for the formation, negotiation, contestation, and transmission of social memory. Among these, inscriptions form an important category and were themselves referred to as hypomnemata, a term that was also used to refer to remembrance days, memorials, monuments, dedications, honorary statues, and crowns. The physical demarcation of sacred space, the monumentality of altars and temples, the placing of votives in sanctuaries created a memory landscape that was of paramount importance for the ancient worshipper and viewer and society at large. Sanctuaries were indeed lieux de mémoire. Given their core activities as managers of sanctuaries and the rites that took place within them, a priest's and memory focus is an obvious one, and it is surprising that the question has not been asked much, let alone in an assessment of priestly authority and priestly agency vis-à-vis religious norms. The reasons for this seem to me to be the following. Firstly, it is once more our understanding of the embeddedness of Greek religious practice in the political realm of the polis that cautions us. Religious norms that created collective memories were produced by political institutions, and the agents in these processes were citizens, not priests. The second reason, linked to the first, is the observation that Greek religion was not a religion in which the knowledge of sacred texts that regulated orthodox religious practices was firmly in the hands of priests and scribes. In Egypt and Babylonia, which we tend to use as examples, priests and scribes, in mostly inherited roles, had exclusive access and therefore control over the creation and preservation of cultural memories. In contrast, Greek religion was a religion in which neither dogmatic sacred texts nor privileged understanding of ritual practices existed. These are caveats that I do not want to ignore, but it looks to me as if neither prohibits a role of priesthood in processes of memory creation and control. In fact, I would like to show that the Greek civic priest was a privileged agent in the formulation of ritual norms, that a special priestly access to tradition and memory did exist, and that precisely sharing this knowledge was a means of steering collective memories. In order to do so, I want to look at the following. To what extent did priesthood convey agency and authority in the formulation and observation of regulations about religious matters? And secondly, how were priests involved in the creation of what John Delury has termed sacred histories? This is the beginning of an inscription from Halicarnassus. It was decided at the proposal of son of Aristocles to transfer from the old stele, which stands by the statues of Poseidon Isthmios, the names of those who have been, since the time of the foundation, hereditary priests of Poseidon, whose cult was founded by those who led the colony from Troezen for Poseidon and Apollo. The lines are followed by a list of 28 priests going back to Telamon, the son of Poseidon. Adding up the number of years served by each priest, the years are given next to the priests' names in the inscription, we go back 504 years, perhaps even 827 years if we add another list of priests from a new fragment that Sinye Izaga published in 2015. A good starting point to bring together priests, collective memory, and the crucial memory medium epigraphy. The history of the city from its foundation captured in priesthood, placed next to the cult statues of the god, and an interest in retaining this narrative by renewing and expanding the list. The inscription is transferred from an old stele to a new one. But, you may say, the priests are not agents here. We're dealing with a civic decree, and the priesthood is a hereditary one, not representative for Greek priesthood as such. Let me address the point of hereditary priesthood briefly. Common sense tells us that a priest appointed for life, let alone as part of family descent, can easily be interpreted as a creator and guardian of memories in the realm of sanctuary and cult, but that this is doubtful for an annual priest who was perhaps appointed by lot. Duration of office creates differences, of course, but this should not guide all investigation. André Mott, for example, makes the fascinating observation that authors such as Plato and Euripides magnify the figure of the priest in contrast to a rather banal image that we get from epigraphic sources. But he sadly hesitates to let his survey of the literary sources invite us to revise our idea of Greek priesthood because, as he says, these address idealized and lifelong priesthood. I would argue that in terms of community-wide collective memories, there is surprising overlap, and I want to focus on this overlap, the essence of priesthood, as I called it before, that both types of priesthood share. This paper cannot focus on priesthood in Plato, but one should note that even within the framework of ideal cities, Plato acknowledges what is Athenian contemporary practice, both hereditary and annual priesthoods. With regard to the medium of epigraphy, I am backed up by the fact that priest lists of annual priesthoods were displayed as regularly as those of hereditary priests in the Greek world, and that this was not linked to the priesthood being eponymous, in which case we could assign practical purposes to such lists. In fact, eponymy existed also when priests were appointed for life. It is also noteworthy that in Athens, both genos and democratic priests were honoured for the same services and qualities, to the extent that we cannot tell from the decrees whether it was a priesthood of the one or the other type. Socioeconomic shifts in the Hellenistic period impacted both democratic and genos priesthoods, and both continued to be commemorated through inscribed votive and honorary monuments into the Roman period. Let me turn then to the important point about civic decrees. Indeed, most inscriptions concerning ritual norms set up in Greek sanctuaries stem from civic interventions. But what does that mean with regard to agency and authority? The important work on the epigraphic material formerly labelled Leges Sacrae by Maître Cabon, Vinciane, and other scholars has shown that decrees and other texts stem from within a field of social negotiation of the most complex nature. As Eftichias Stavrianopoulos says, individuals and groups equipped with different sorts of symbolic capital act in a complementary yet competing fashion. We don't know who the proposer of this particular decree from Halicarnassus was, but even in the many cases where we have a name, we do not learn much about a proposer. The nature of collective decision-making required transparency, with regard to agency, but also tried to negate agency because it was important that everyone, agents and audience, had the same knowledge that communication took place on equal terms. We can ask, and often deduce from motivation clauses and content, who had an interest in proposing a move. In this case, to not simply start a new continuing list when space ran out, but to transfer the old names and to point in the preface to the link between the city's foundation, priesthood, and identity. While the question of who had an interest may be too one-dimensional, it reminds us that civic consensus expressed in decrees and public inscriptions stands at the end of a process. Apart from the fact that this was not a straightforward process, the monument that was created could still influence and be influenced by individuals' changing views of the past. The collectively agreed narrative has an afterlife. This is what Polly Lowe observes when looking at, I quote her, the range of things the Athenians did to their inscriptions. As the text from Halicarnassus illustrates, inscriptions can be reinscribed and the location of their display moved. Lowe concludes that collective memory is an aggregation of individual memories and memory acts rather than something centrally controlled, and that collective memory is fluid and potentially contested. Although Lowe focuses on documents relating to the 30, an exceptionally delicate situation of memory control in Athens, her conclusions have general application and, as she stresses, include forms of inscribed texts other than decrees, such as catalogues and dedications. The role of the individual matters, and there is continued interaction between individual, community, and inscribed monument. Recently, Borja Diaz Arino published an article in which he uses Cicero's speeches against Verres as a rare opportunity to examine how audiences interpreted messages conveyed by the dozen inscriptions mentioned here. Distinct phases in the reception process of the epigraphic message can be identified. The role of war memorials in the direct memory of those who were alive when the statues were returned began to lose relevance, but the statues evolved into symbols of the special connection between the cities and Rome, and the restoration of the inscriptions in the imperial period turned them into a key element in the construction of the city's collective memory. So all this background to show that there are many reasons why inscribed monuments, while they strongly forged collective memories, did not, for those involved in these processes and experiencing their display, simply reflect collective agency and collectively agreed narratives of the past. But how can we detect priestly input, and to what extent can we escape the question of formal authority? A proposal reflected initiative and reasoning, but it had to be accepted by the community. Edward Harris has tried to approach Greek regulations about religious matters from the legal perspective. On first sight, the argument of priestly authority looks bleak. Religious officials act in accordance with the laws of the polis, just like other public officials, and their religious function does not give them a privileged position vis-à-vis the assembly and the courts. Harris also notes, however, that the people who drafted sacred laws invoked ta patria as the sources of authority for their proposals. And indeed, the expression kata ta patria is frequent in epigraphic texts that describe religious norms. I wonder to what extent it was a topos and what its functions and semantics were for those who used and heard it, and of course, how it related to priests. Harris goes as far as to say, I quote, all Greeks knew what ta patria was. No need to define certain key terms such as thuein and thusia, sponde and spondein, pompe and pompewein, horkos, ara, ekphora, kathairo, and katharmos in Greek sacred regulations. And all levels had access to ta patria, even if they sometimes rely on Pan-Hellenic shrines or local exegetes for guidance. Ta patria were, or were believed to be, older than the polis. The polis did not create them. I would argue that the difference between were or were believed to matters, and that priests had a role in both. Susan Cole describes the expression as a phrase ancient administrators used when they wished to emphasize a solemn occasion or the long life and hallowed origin of a ritual. A database search shows the expression as exceptionally frequent in Athens for several centuries, but also used in Delphi, Asia Minor, and the Aegean Islands, occasionally elsewhere. It appears predominantly in the context of the worship of the gods and their sanctuaries to describe the way in which sacrifices were to be performed, offering tables arranged, priestly shares apportioned, processions conducted. Some texts use the expression katata patria in combination with the nomoi or nomima, but it is not clear whether this is in contrast or doubling of authorization. In decrees that stipulate a change with regard to religious matters, the expression indicates that everything else that takes place or is to take place as it was being done before. This would certainly include earlier legislation, but also rituals and specifications for which written evidence did not exist, not necessarily known, let alone remembered by all. It is difficult to imagine that any other than priests would, on an everyday basis, have had authority to inform about the content of ta patria, which they would have learned from previous priests and other cult personnel. Regularly, they must have improvised, implemented changes as they saw fit, unless they were challenged. Our most famous instance of conflict over religious norms, katata patria, relates to the Athenian recodification of their laws in the last decade of the 5th century. In Lysias 30, Nicomachus, the nomon anagrapheus, is accused of having inscribed religious norms, especially sacrifices, that were not katata patria. The speaker says, "And how could a man show greater piety than mine, when I demand, first, that our sacrifices be performed according to our ancestral rules, katata patria, and second, that they be those which tend to promote the interests of the city, and finally those which the people have decreed and which we shall be able to afford out of the public revenue. But you, Nicomachus, have done the opposite of this. By entering in your copy a greater number than had been ordained, you have caused the public revenue to be expended on these, and hence to be deficient for our ancestral offerings. Tais patrios thesiais." This and further passages in the speech illustrate how difficult it was to reconstruct, differentiate and decide between old laws, solons curbes are specifically referenced, inconsistent public decrees, and surely also ritual norms that were believed to be customary, but whose legal enactment could not be proven. In most general terms, the relationship between inscriptions and their content and other sources of collective and individual memory, potentially but not necessarily written, is at stake here. When we try to imagine what and whom Nicomachus would have consulted during his 6 years that he spent on his task, publicly inscribed documents, decrees, and laws committed to perishable material, or the routine of local religious calendars, we will be taken to sanctuaries and their priests. Cities did not conduct a systematic review of their laws on a regular basis, and katata patria was probably rarely challenged. But in the same way as our speaker uses the term, the frequent references to Katata Patria in both epigraphic and literary sources provides its guarantor with symbolic capital and gives reassurance to their audience that tradition was respected, that a civic intervention was taking place merely as a response to a particular situation, and that it was limited. This is a decree from Lagina, Inschriften von Stratonicea 512, inscribed on the narrow faces of 2 altar blocks in the sanctuary of Phecaté. Ried van Bremen has argued for the war against Aristonicus 133 to 129 BC, but the context of the Mithridatic Wars is also possible. I want to focus on the last lines of the inscription and the expression Katata Patria here. So here are the last few lines. With good fortune, it was decided, on account of this decree, everything else concerning the management in the sanctuary is to be according to both the ancestral regulations and that which has been decided before. Similarly, the inscribing of the dedications. It's not an easy document at all to understand, and of course, what was decreed follows where the stone breaks off. We also do not know, if you go back, whether there was a gap between the 2 fragments. I suspect not, because it would have made it a very long preamble, but we cannot be sure. But the preamble describes the power of the goddess who saved the city in serious military danger, after which it gained freedom and autonomy. In her new monograph on sacred landscapes in Hellenistic Asia Minor, Christina Williamson refers to this inscription as indicating some kind of return after a crisis to the administration of the sanctuary as it had been before, according to the traditions and earlier decrees. In my opinion,